Hello, I am Jill Schwartzman, Executive Editor at Dutton, and I have been so privileged to work with Janice Kaplan for the past 5.5 years, and I couldn't be happier than to introduce her today at this wonderful event. Back in 2015, when I first started working with Janice, I was at a crossroads in my life. I was about to become a parent for the first time, and I was ready for a book that would help me understand my life in a whole new way. And Janice's first book for Dutton, The Gratitude Diaries, was the book that did it, encouraging me to think about my home, my relationships, my work, and my whole life in a new positive and from a new positive and inspiring perspective. Then, in 2018, Janice, who, as you know, is a longtime journalist, magazine editor, and TV producer, came to me with a new idea, one that would become the Genius of Women. But when she first told me about the idea, I didn't immediately get it. I thought, the Genius of Women, sure, that's great, but is this really new information? I was so wrong, and I found out as soon as Janice told me this one incredible statistic that I found shocking and unbelievable, that in a national survey of thousands of Americans, 90% of the people who took the survey said that they believed that geniuses were more likely to be men. When those same people were asked to name a male genius, they came up with 5, 10 names, no problem. But when they asked to name a female genius, they could only come up with one name, Marie Curie. Once I learned this fact and began to read the incredible pages that Janice put together, my opinion was completely transformed. I realized how much the world needed this book, how much I needed this book. And after reading this book, I am confident that those perceptions will change, that people will be able to name so many female geniuses. The book includes stories both past and present, ranging from Mozart's forgotten genius sister to current names like Nobel winner Frances Arnold. You'll read this, you'll be surprised, occasionally outraged, but also delighted and inspired, whoever you are and whatever you do, by the Genius of Women. But you've heard enough from me. Now I will turn it over to the amazing Janice Kaplan. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here. Thank you, Jill. With due respect to all of the other editors here, she's the best editor ever. And it's really exciting for me to get to talk about the Genius of Women for the very first time. You know, you all know, when you're a writer, your books are like your children. You love them all equally. And if there's one that you love just a little bit more than the others, you never admit it in public. So I certainly wouldn't compare The Genius of Women to anything else I've written, except to say that this book is deeply, deeply meaningful to me. And as Jill said, I was inspired to write this book after a survey that said 90% of Americans tend to think that geniuses are men. 90%. You can't get 90% of Americans to say they like chocolate ice cream. Yeah. And so I wondered, what do we really mean when we tell girls and young women that they can be anything? That they can be anything except geniuses? I describe in the book that when I was 9 years old, our family doctor warned my mother that I was reading too much. And my mom asked if all the reading was hurting my eyes, and he said, no, 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 the eyes are fine, but a girl can be too smart for her own good. Too smart for her own good. My mom seemed to understand it immediately. I didn't know what he was talking about, and neither did the librarian at the little local library where I used to go a couple of times a week. She actually thought it was okay to read, even if you were a girl. And she gave me this wonderful sense of freedom. Actually, it was a very literal sense of freedom, too, because my parents only allowed me to bicycle to the library when I was little. I guess they thought of it as a place of safety. And for me, that's what libraries have always been, that duality of a place of freedom and a place of safety. And that was my first great library. It was very small, but it was a great library. Many years later, when I graduated college, I had a fellowship from Yale to research my first book, and I wrote it in the Frederick Lewis Allen Room of the New York Public Library, which was my second great library. At the time, it was a place, and I think it still is, where there were about a dozen private carrels, and there were great researchers there. I don't know why they let me in. I think they thought it was cute that I was so young and had a book contract. And you could keep your books there for 6 months or a year, and you had your own space. And you know, I was sort of the mascot for all of the other writers there. They'd take me out to lunch. And when I finished that book, and had the hardcover in my hands, I went back home and I got on my bicycle and I bicycled over to that little library to give the book to the librarian. She had given me so many books, and it meant so much to me to be able to give her my first book. One of the things I discovered while writing The Genius of Women is that genius needs to be nurtured and genius needs to be encouraged. We have a myth of the natural genius, but being a genius isn't like being class president, where you get elected and you're in the yearbook forever after. Genius depends on who is telling your story and how we're looking at it and what the perspective has been on it. Who we consider a genius changes over time. One Cambridge professor who I met while I was writing this book described genius to me as the place where extraordinary talent meets celebrity. Now, he's a Cambridge professor. He did not mean celebrity in any Kardashian kind of way. He meant it simply in the sense of being recognized and being noticed, being appreciated. I discovered that women throughout history have had that extraordinary talent, but too often they have not been noticed and they have not been appreciated. One story, consider the amazing Lise Meitner. She was a physicist in the 1930s, actually in Berlin, and she discovered nuclear fission. That's kind of a big deal to discover nuclear fission, and it won the Nobel Prize. I say it won the Nobel Prize because Lise Meitner did not win the Nobel Prize. Her lab partner, a chemist named Otto Hahn, did win it. Now, from what I've read, Otto Hahn was a perfectly nice man and a very good chemist who understood nothing about nuclear fission. But the Nobel Committee just could not wrap their arms or their brains around the idea that a woman could have had this great breakthrough. Years later, the proceedings of that Nobel Committee were released, and physicists who looked at it came back and said it was one of the most egregious and indefensible oversights ever. And believe me, there is a lot of competition for that title of a most egregious oversight. I was fascinated as I researched this book to discover that in every generation, despite the obstacles they faced, some women, like Lise Meitner, managed to soar so high and achieve so much. And my question was, how do they do it? And what can we all learn from them about our own potential? Dr. Frances Arnold, who did win a Nobel Prize just a year ago, told me how important it is to face the world in a positive and powerful way, and not a negative and fearful one. And having written the Gratitude Diaries, I very much appreciated that. And over again, the women I spoke to were that way. They were so incredibly positive about what they were doing. And as they were rising in their fields, even some very young women who I interviewed, they seemed to put on blinders. And they ignored all the sexism and bias, and they focused on their work. They refused to be restricted by labels. And only when they got to tenured positions, top positions in their fields, where they could actually do something, did they do everything they could to start bringing other women along with them. You know, I thought I was writing about the genius of women when I started this book, but I soon realized that I was writing about all women. Those who could find a way to succeed, those geniuses, those others who found that way to succeed, and those who were crushed by the societal pressures, as Jill mentioned, Mozart's sister. Another composer whose story I was incredibly touched by was Fanny Mendelssohn, who was a child prodigy back in the 1800s, or very early 1800s, and the sister of Felix Mendelssohn. She gave a concert when she was 12 that was said to be breathtaking. She was a prodigy, she was a wonderful composer, she was actually, in almost every way, much better than her brother. But then when she was 14, her father, Abraham, wrote her a letter. It's probably a letter many of you have seen, because he says to her that for Felix, music can be his career and his future, but for her, it was just to be an ornament, not the root of her being. Only it was the root of her being. Instead, she was sent home to be a good housewife and to get married. And every time I read that letter, it breaks my heart. Could you imagine telling a man, a great prodigy, that, okay, all done, time to go home and be a dad? And he would say, are you kidding me? Why can't I be both? Well, Fanny is one of the women who actually did do the great workaround. Mozart's sister disappeared, her talent lost. But Fanny continued to have salons at her home where she played music, and she composed. And she continued to compose, and she published her music under Felix's name. He said he was doing her a big favor. But come on. What a nice way to avoid competition from your sister. I say beware of men who say they're protecting you. Queen Victoria once invited Felix to Buckingham Palace, and she thanked him for writing one of her very favorite songs. Well, what could the man say? He knew Fanny had written it. I wrote most of this book at the library of the Yale Club, which is sort of my third great library in my life. And to me, librarians aren't just geniuses, you're magicians. One day I was looking online for a particular article about Madame de Staël, who is a wonderful activist around the time of the French Revolution, who had incredible power, stood up to Napoleon, had a great following, one of the first women who figured out the idea of having salons so intellectuals can come to your house, and even though women weren't allowed to be educated, you get them there and they educate you anyway. Anyway, I was looking for an article about her. I couldn't find it, and I went to the wonderful librarian there and asked her for help. And she said, no problem. And in half an hour, it was on my desk. I don't understand how you do it. But I do know that genius comes in many forms. And sometimes it's appreciated, and sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's noticed, and sometimes it's not. So I do thank all of you for all that you do to encourage genius, to inspire young women and girls, and I hope to get books like mine into the hands of those for whom it will also be deeply meaningful. Thank you.